The fourth kind of feeling reality that codependents feel is adult to child carried feeling reality. It's really the same thing as number 2, adult to adult induced, but this adult to child carried feeling reality is about feelings we picked up off our parents as they were abusing us, and carry for those parents and had no way of releasing any more than we had any way of releasing that child feeling reality. When we were kids, we took on feeling reality that they weren't willing to deal with. That too gets triggered by our environment. Now, in terms of this lecture, because I'm lecturing about shame, when we have something happen in our environment that triggers number 4 in terms of carried shame, that's when we feel the worthless feeling. That's when we have that drop in value, that something is happening in our environment that triggers that old feeling reality that we took on board from our parents or our major caregivers as they were being shameless, and we took on their shame for them. Parents, I believe, are shameless whenever they abuse their kids, and I don't care whether it's physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, intellectual abuse, social abuse, or there's some others. I don't care what kind of abuse it is. If a parent is taking advantage of a child and abusing them, they are in a state of shamelessness. That's why when a child is being abused, they start feeling worthless. It's a message to the child during the time of abuse is that something's wrong with them. And that's how shame, again, is connected to the illness, because through our feeling reality, when we carry shame for others, it puts us into the sense of being worth less. It's only other people's shame that makes us feel worth less, especially the old shame carried from the major caregivers who abused us. Sometimes with this adult-to-adult induced feeling reality, when we're around another shameless adult, have you noticed that you don't necessarily feel worthless as they're being shameless, but you just feel embarrassed for them? Yeah. As an adult, we have some protection when we're around a shameless person because our brains will tell us that they're being shameless, and we can kind of know that and not have that drop in worth, but just feel embarrassed for them. However, during extreme abuse, when we're around a real shameless person, like getting raped, a rapist is a shameless offender. Victims of rape feel worthless because they're being treated like they're worthless, and also because the offender is being shameless. So depending upon the intensity of the offense when you're around a shameless person will affect whether you just feel embarrassed for them or have a drop in the sense of worth. But can you see how shame affects all those dynamics? That carried shame, it's carried shame or induced shame that makes a person feel worthless, not their own shame. And during any experience of child abuse, where the message from the parent to the child is that they are worthless, there is a drop in a sense of value, and it's the shame taken off the parent that makes the child start to feel worthless. Now, in terms of the disease, there's another interesting dynamic, and that has to do with another dynamic of child abuse. And that is this, that there's actually 2 kinds of child abuse in terms of the issue of shame. There is child abuse that makes the child feel worth less, and there's child abuse that makes the child feel better than. Did you notice that? As you inventoried your own issues of abuse, that sometimes the way your parents treated you made you feel worthless, and sometimes according to how they were treated you felt better than. The kind of abuse that makes a child feel worthless we call disempowering abuse. The kind of child abuse that makes a child feel better than is called false empowering abuse. They have different dynamics to them. Basically, when you experience disempowering abuse, it makes you feel worthless as a child. When you experience falsely empowering abuse as a child, you wind up feeling better than, which sets up the dynamic of the first core symptom, difficulty experiencing appropriate levels of self-esteem. Now, what I say when I'm teaching people to track this stuff is I tell them that the roots of their illness, the very roots of their illness, is about child abuse. Their roots of their illness feed a generator of the illness, what I call a generator of the illness. Another way to talk about this generator of the illness is I call the generator their shame issues. In the disease of codependence, because of the empowering and disempowering abuse, you will see that codependents have two issues around shame. This I would tell you is very important. In the codependent, when you examine them, you will find the codependent has three dynamics in terms of these shame issues. They are a codependent who has too much of somebody else's shame. In other words, they carry around shame from another person that makes them feel worthless. On the other hand, in the disease too, you can see that oftentimes it's not that they have too much of somebody else's shame, they have too little of their own. Those are the shame issues in the disease. We experience too little of our own shame or too much of somebody else's, which sets up the shame dynamics in the illness of codependence. Why would we have too much shame from somebody else? Because we've picked it up and taken it on board and handled it like our own, which makes us feel worthless. On the other hand, we can experience too little of our own shame. And in that experience, we get set up to be shameless. When we get set up to be shameless, we have a tendency to be an offender. Are you following me so far? I can rattle this stuff off in my sleep, but I don't know how fast people can track it. When we feel too much of somebody else's shame, we're set up to be what? The opposite. A big victim, because we feel too worthless to defend ourselves. Here, because of lacking a sense of our own shame, we're set up to be offender because we don't know our poop smells. And something else can't happen that's very interesting. Shame not only allows us to be accountable for our adverse impact on others, it also causes us to put a limit on our own reality, because we know we'd had better be careful with it. We know we can be out of bounds with this, and it's our own sense of shame that causes us to put a limit on ourselves. When we have too little shame, we don't have enough to set limits on ourselves. That's what sets us up to be an offender. When we have too much of somebody else's, it causes us to feel worthless and fail to defend ourselves. But when we have too much of somebody else, when we don't have enough of our own, it sets us up to be out of control. How do you think? Well, let me not ask you questions about this. I'll just flail away at it. One of the things I noticed when I was trying to figure out these dynamics for myself was that when I thought about it, and I remember babies being born, because I am an RN and I've delivered a few of those against my will, but I did deliver a few of them. I noticed that babies at birth can feel pain, and they can feel joy, and they can feel fear, and they can feel anger readily. Soon after birth, they can feel all that stuff, and I'll let you know about it. But there's two emotions they don't feel. Well, actually, three. What are those three? Shame, guilt, and lust. Have you ever seen a baby feel shame? No. They don't get embarrassed. Did you ever see one feel guilty? No, they don't feel guilt, and they also don't feel lust either. Those are emotions that are developed later on and take a certain amount of anatomy and physiology growth in order to even feel. How do you think a child learns to feel their own shame? How does that come about, do you think? How does a person become a person who has too little of their own shame? How do you think a child learns? How does that come about? Yeah, from their parents confronting. A child learns to feel their own shame as the parent respectfully confronts the child about their poop smelling. That's how a child learns to feel shame. Daniel, my son Daniel, is probably the best example of all. I've given this example before, but it's so common everybody can identify with it. Daniel doesn't like to eat in public with manners. He could care less about that. He eats with his hands. He eats fast, and he puts as much in his mouth as he can. Now, I really don't care if Daniel's by himself if he eats that way, but when we go to a Mexican restaurant, I really don't appreciate him stuffing a whole enchilada in his mouth in about 2 seconds. I sit there and gag. It bothers me. And I don't want him to do it because I want him to have manners. So what I do when we go to restaurants, and we always get into this, Daniel, you're in a restaurant now, let's eat with some manners. These are the family rules. As he is stuffing the whole enchilada in his mouth, I confront him. I say, Daniel, put it down on the plate. Cut it up in little pieces, put it one bite at a time in your mouth, chew it and swallow it. Guess what he does? I don't say that so anybody can hear me. I only say it so Daniel can hear, and he does this all the time. His face turns red and he does this. And then pulls it all out of his mouth, puts it on his plate and cuts it up. But that little pink thing behind his face is called his shame. And I do that as his parent. I confront his issues of his perfect imperfection. So does his sister. We all went on vacation about a month ago. And she got to deal with it too. It was really funny. It exhausted her as much as it did me, getting him to eat. I think we were in a power struggle, though. I think something else was going on with Daniel, and he was enjoying grossing us out. But anyway, that's a whole other issue. But when you confront your child's issues of perfect imperfection, you teach them to feel their own shame. If you had a parent that didn't correct you, guess what your problem is going to be? You're not going to have enough shame on board. That's what creates the shameless codependent. They don't have enough of their own. They can still have plenty, though, of somebody else's. In other words, they can have a shame core, a well house of carried feeling reality from the people who have offended, but in addition to that, have too little of their own. They can also have a well house of carried feeling reality and their own. And some of them, which is really confusing, can have a well house of carried feeling reality and none of their own, which makes people feel crazy. Part of recovery and part of assessing somebody around their shame issue has to do with figuring out how they were abused, how much of their own shame they experience, and how much carried shame they have on board. Can you see what I mean? But always when we look at the issue of shame and the codependent in their disease is that by and large the codependent will have too much of somebody else's or too little of their own or both. Too much of somebody else's sets them up to be a victim and feel worthless. Too little of their own sets them up to be offender and shameless, which creates different kinds of problems. Now, some codependents have another issue, and that is they experience a lot of disempowering abuse. On the other hand, they also experience a lot of empowering abuse where they are taught that they are better than other people. And another thing that goes along with this dynamic is not only are they taught that they are better than other people, they're also taught to be good and perfect, and so that they can judge others and feel better than. That's another dynamic in this illness. Some of us just flat out get told we're worthless. We never get empowered. We never get told that we're better than because we're black, white, Chicano, Christians, Catholics, Jews, or whatever we want to do that makes us feel better than. We never get that kind of palaver from anybody. We're just taught we're worthless. So we always ride in the one-down position. But those of us who are taught, ashamed, but also taught that we were better than because we were white or whatever, also have that dynamic of judging others who don't meet the mark that we meet, so we feel better than and look down on others, but we also feel worthless at the same time. And are busy being good and perfect so that we can judge others and feel better than, if we don't just flat out judge them and say we're better than because we're black, we're white, we're Catholic, or whatever we're doing to make ourselves feel better than. All that's about the illness. All that is about attempting to heal the wound of shame by judging others and feeling better than in that judgment. Perfectionism is also about this whole dynamic. Perfectionism is about being perfect so that when you're busy judging others, you can always feel better than because you did it better than. Not that you're perfect, though. It's only that you decided what was perfect, hit that mark, and then noticing everybody in your environment who's not doing that so you can feel better than. That's also part of this disease. Whenever you are engaging perfectionism or being judgmental, then you're in your first core symptom, difficulty experiencing appropriate levels of self-esteem. You're busy being better than. And I want to tell you something about that stuff. When you're judging other people, guess what they're going to know? They always know you're doing it. Don't think that when you're judging others, that they don't know you're doing it. Because when you're doing that, your face will be doing something really weird. Your face will do this. And they'll have a sense you're looking down your nose at them, and you are. Because you're being good and perfect, judging them so you can feel better than and heal that old shame wound, that wound that tells you you're worthless because your parents treated you like you were worthless. Do you see how this issue of shame keeps coming in and leaking in? It's not that complicated, though. It's about having too little of your own or too much of somebody else's. Having enough of your own is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful gift to you. Enables you to be accountable and still feel comfortable as you're accountable, knowing you're not worthless. You just know your poop smells, and sometimes it smells so bad you have to make amends and stop your behavior, period. That's just it. That's just what happens. Part of recovery. And you learn to get comfortable with that and not worry about it. When I make a mistake now, I don't care. I get into some wild experiences when I'm doing my work. I forget what I was supposed to be lecturing about. Sometimes I get way off on a tangent. I can't remember what I was lecturing about. I have to ask the audience, what was I talking about? Do you remember? I don't care. I really don't care. If it bothers people enough to the point where they don't come and listen to me, then I'll go do something else. It really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. It only matters that I don't offend you to me. It only matters that I don't break your boundaries, that I don't plunge through your boundaries and offend you in some way by being a boundary violator. Other than that, I really don't care if you see that my poop smells. As long as it's not one of those things that's really terrible. You know, so I don't tell you about that stuff. That's why I never talk about being a sex addict. I was supposed to give my story at an SLA thingamajig up in Cleveland the other day, you know, and I was relieved to find out because I got all screwed up. I hadn't asked Barbara what I was supposed to talk about, and I couldn't. I thought maybe I've got to talk about being a sex addict. All I really wanted to talk about is being a love addict, not a sex addict. And I got into this profound attack of panic, thinking I had to do that because, of course, that's when your poop really smells, isn't it? And I hate to be real public with that, but anyway. What I noticed, which makes it very hard to recover from the disease, is that in regards to the core symptoms, the core symptoms being self-esteem issues, boundary issues, reality issues, dependency issues around needs and wants. When we look at the first 4 primary or core symptoms of the disease of codependence, I have noticed that people have shame bound to each one of these core symptoms, which effectively keeps a person from getting into recovery from the symptoms of the illness. And that comes from being shamed as a child around these very issues. If a child has a lot of disempowering abuse and gets told that they are worthless, they will essentially wind up with what we call a shame self-esteem bind or a shame value bind. What that means is that when this person becomes an adult and is working to experience their own sense of value, learning how to affirm themselves, learning how to go against the message that somehow they're worthless, what will happen is they will have a shame attack. A shame attack is a sudden, overwhelming sense of being a worthless person. Puts you in that one-down position. If a child has been shamed as a child for esteeming themselves, when they work on their self-esteem issues today, they will have a shame attack when they're in the midst of it and somebody else is noticing this is going on. In other words, if they have a shame self-esteem bind or a shame value bind, today, as they state to another person that they are a worthwhile human being, it'll be followed by a shame attack. How you know you have a shame bind is that whenever you experience the reality of wherever the bind is, you will have a shame attack. A shame attack means you have a shame bind. If you have a shame bind, it means you'll have a shame attack whenever you go to experience that. So today in recovery, as you're trying to esteem yourself and you're doing it in front of somebody else, you'll have a shame attack. This shame self-esteem bind can also have 2 kind of quirky looking experiences of what I would call a shame self-esteem bind, but it comes in the form of 2 other binds, but they're all related. One is a shame affirmation bind and the other is a shame existence bind. When a child lives in a family of origin that shames them for having been born, they will have a shame existence bind, which makes it really hard to want to be alive. They'll feel worthless about being alive. They'll be in a process of constantly trying to die. They will not think they're worth living. This is probably the very, very worst shame bind a person can have. It's set up by parents saying to children that they didn't want them. That when they were born, they destroyed somebody. Like people said, oh, you killed your mother when you were born, or you ruined her permanently. Having a mother say to a child that you destroyed my life by being born will set up a shame existence bind. It's the very worst shame bind around this issue of value, because it takes away a person's right to be alive. You can also have a shame affirmation bind, which means you got shamed as a child for affirming yourself or esteeming yourself. And so today, when you affirm yourself and somebody else is noticing that, you will have a shame attack. I used to get into this constantly. I'd get into a shame affirmation bind or a shame existence bind when I was doing my work. I go lecture to people. And I was always a reluctant warrior. I still don't even like doing this. I only do this because it seems to be what I'm supposed to be doing. But I really don't, I don't like to be up here with you all looking at me. What happens is that, this is what used to happen, and now I'm kind of gotten over it. But what would happen is that you would come up and say, oh, you're just so neat and helpful to me. And then I'd have a massive shame attack. It would be awful. It's like I'd put it out there and then somebody come up and say, oh, that was so helpful, and I'd have a massive shame attack. That's a shame affirmation bind. As you affirm me, I have a shame attack. And that used to make it real hard to get out and do my work because I couldn't stand it. Because it was so painful to have you affirm me. Now that's what a shame affirmation bind is. Or somebody come up and say, oh, Pia, I'm so glad you're alive. You have been so helpful to me. And I'd get into a shame existence bind and have a shame attack because you affirmed the fact that I was alive and helpful to you. Do you know how awful that was getting over that? Most lecturers in the field don't come from my position. Most people who work in the field and are speakers do not come from the kind of disempowering abuse that I had. Most of them are empowered codependents, falsely empowered codependents. Most speakers in the field come from a position of one up. I've come from the position of one down, which is why I have trouble doing it in the first place. Not that I have trouble talking. I don't have trouble talking. Just ask my husband. But I have trouble with you all looking at me and saying things to me that feel nice and affirming, because I have these shame value binds, shame affirmation binds, and shame existence binds. Now, I've worked through that shame existence bind, and most of the time I'm not doing that. Every now and then it'll hit me, and I always know I'm in this bind with shame, because my mind will start thinking about not wanting to live anymore, and that still happens to me. Sometimes it's just like a struggle, like I don't want to be doing this anymore. I just wish I could just stop breathing, kind of float off into oblivion. It's just a struggle to be doing this, because deep inside myself, nobody taught me to affirm my right to exist, and I have a hard time with that process of affirmation within myself that I have a right to exist, I have a right to breathe, I have a right to take up space, I have a right to use stuff out of my environment. It's deeper than the shame affirmation bind. The shame existence bind is the very worst wound of all. Do y'all know what I'm talking about? I don't want to beat this subject to death, but it's a horrible thing. This is probably the worst one again of all. The shame existence bind. If you don't have that one, you have a shame affirmation bind. If you don't have that one, you have a shame value bind. Another bind that we see with the disease is that people have shame boundary binds. This means whenever they go to set a boundary with another person, they will have a shame attack. Always remember, shame attack, shame bind mean the same thing. As they go to set an external boundary with someone and set a limit on somebody's body coming after them, they have a massive shame attack. Or if somebody says to them, hey, your body is to stop and not touch me, you have a shame attack because somebody's setting a boundary with you. Either way, coming and going. If somebody shamed you as a child for attempting to set a physical boundary with them or a sexual boundary, today when you go into that experience, you'll have a massive shame attack. An example of how a shame boundary bind can be set up is in a family system where somebody's out of control as an adult, abusing a child physically or sexually. The child crabs about it, complains about it, says, I don't want to kiss Aunt Harriet. But Aunt Harriet keeps coming to the house and planting these big wet kisses on this kid's face, and the mother goes, shame on you, how can you say that about poor Aunt Harriet? You stand there and you let her do that to you. That'll set up a shame physical boundary or possibly a shame sexual boundary bind with that child later on as an adult. So when he as an adult tries to set a physical limit on a female or a sexual limit on a female, that person will have a shame attack. in attempting to set a boundary. You can have shame bound to your external boundary, shame bound to your external physical boundaries, shame bound to your external sexual boundary, or shame bound to your internal boundary. Your internal boundary is another way to set limits on people. And it's the boundary that tells you you create your reality and others create theirs. And whenever you're about stating that out into the environment, you're listening to somebody's incoming reality, knowing that they've created it, knowing that you create your own, not taking ownership for what somebody else has created, and you verbalize that, you'll have a shame attack. That's a shame internal boundary bind. You can also have shame bound to any part of your reality. If you were shamed as a child for having that reality, somebody shamed you about your body and told you were ugly, had big ears, flat feet, pimples, and shamed you about that experience of your body, you have a shame body bind. Sexual abuse victims, incest survivors of molestation have shame body binds. That's why they often develop a wall of fat to cover it up so you can't tell what it is. So you can't see their body. That's to avoid the shame. They start losing weight. Guess what they get into? Massive shame attacks about their body. They don't want it touched. They don't want it looked at. They have terrible problems. When they arrest their eating disorder, they go into this massive other problems around a shame body bind. They can have a shame thinking bind. If they got shame for their thinking as children, then today they will have a shame attack whenever they verbalize a thought to another human being and they're in the awareness of the other person being haven't heard that, they'll have a shame attack. They can have a shame feeling bind. They can have a shame bound to pain. They can have a shame pain bind, a shame fear bind, a shame anger bind, a shame joy bind. Anybody in here have a shame joy bind? That means whenever you're happy, you'll have a shame attack. Anybody do that? They get happy and then they feel worthless because they're happy? That's a shame joy bind. Get in pain and then feel worthless because somebody else is in the knowing of them having pain, in the knowing of them having joy, seeing that they're angry, seeing that they're afraid. Those are all shame binds with feeling reality. Or you can have shame bound to your behavior. That means when anybody's observing your behavior, no matter what it is, you'll have a shame attack. Like you can just be doing something very simple and somebody walks up and makes a comment about it and you have a shame attack. I used to have that bind too, which made it very hard to lecture. Because whenever you were noticing anything about me, half the time I was in a massive shame attack as I was trying to talk. It was terrible. It was a lot of work to talk publicly.